Hi there, my name is Elizabeth Buckner. This is my second video entry for Diversity in Adolescent Literature at Michigan State University. Today I'm talking about the book American Born Chinese and Asian Americans and their representation in modern youth literature and adolescent literature. So one of the articles we talked about this week was an article by Yokota, and the article begins with this idea that, introducing readers to this idea that most stories about Asian Americans are set in ancient times, are almost set up like folklore, that they're set in really exotic places and they make the people seem really exotic. And I thought that I could really relate this back to what we had talked about earlier in the course about people of American Indian origin and their representation in American literature and media in general. This idea that they're a non-existent people, almost, and we only see representations of them really exotic and wild, and the old Western films. That's really the only real representation that we have of them in media, and I could really relate that back to what Yokota was saying about how modern children's books are, or most stories are, only talking about this ancient and exotic aspect. And I really thought that some of the statistics were really interesting. The Yokota article talks about the Cooperative Children's Book Center. In 1994, they began keeping statistics about different representations of people in children's books, and only 65 of 3,000 accurately represented Asian Americans, which is a huge, 3,000 is a huge number, 65 is not very many, only 2%. So, that's really crazy, and the fact that there isn't an accurate representation is almost, it's kind of disturbing. As a teacher, when I am looking for literature for my classroom, you really want to make sure that literature is really accurate and up to date and represents everyone in a fair and authentic way. And the fact that there aren't that many resources out there is a little bit scary and disheartening. I also made a connection between the Yokota article and the model minority article that we read the week before in class, and we talked about in class. The whole idea that most stories represent Asian Americans in this exotic context, like ancient folklore, this almost like they don't exist anymore, or Asian people in general, that they kind of don't inhabit American society, that nobody needs to worry about discriminating against them because they aren't, relevant or highly represented in our society. And also the idea of the model minority, that even if they are in our society, they're this model minority, and that white people don't need to worry about I guess writing prejudice things or representing them in a way that could be harmful or stereotypical, because they're this model minority and they've overcome these barriers, and that they can't be offended, or they're no longer discriminated against. I found that really interesting, and I thought that that was a really interesting way of defending that. I don't know if I agree with it, but it definitely is really interesting. The Yokota article goes on to talk about the representation of Asian Americans in society, and that when we're looking for good children's books, or books in general about Asian Americans or people of Asian descent, it's important to have a range of representation. And so this is a theme we had talked about earlier in the course, avoiding the single story, this like single notion of these people, and also an authentic representation. Not only that the story is authentic, but that the author is authentic as well. And so those authentic experiences will make their way into the story. And also the need for a balanced perspective. Yokota goes on to talk about how a lot of Asian Americans are lumped together in like one homogeneous group, and I thought that this was really interesting because this also happens for people of American Indian origin. A lot of different tribes are just kind of lumped together the same way that Asian Americans are, and that specific culture isn't accurately represented because you're representing this like whole lump of people which maybe don't share very many cultural ties or anything like that. So I think that the need for a balanced perspective and a variety of perspectives is really, really awesome. It's a really great idea, not only including Japanese literature in your classroom, but also including maybe Korean, maybe Vietnamese, maybe Chinese, and also thinking about the backgrounds of your students, knowing and understanding their background. A really big stereotype that I guess white Americans have about Asian people of Asian origin is that they're all Chinese. This is like a really common stereotype that I've heard a lot. Not everyone is Chinese, and not everyone comes from a Chinese background. And it's important to understand the cultures that your students are coming from, because Chinese culture and Korean culture, very different. So definitely looking into those things, understanding them, and making sure that you have a variety of texts in your classroom that authentically represent those people. So, great, thanks.